That's brought to you by the Wallace Center's Food Systems Leadership Network. For those of you not familiar with the FSLN, we are a national peer learning community that connects current and emerging leaders, strengthens individual and collective leadership capacity, and fosters collaboration across communities. I'm Ellie Baumstein with the Wallace Center. I'm calling in from DC, and I'm going to be sort of your MC today. And I'm also joined by some Wallace Center colleagues who are going to help with facilitation and some presenters who are going to talk about what's going on in their communities. Briefly, tech run through, everybody is automatically muted. If you're able to, we love to see people's videos. It's nice to see some smiling faces for those of us that have been trapped in our apartments. But we will have a chance for people to ask questions later. And if you have questions, you can put them in the chat box as they occur to you, and we'll handle asking them, and we'll also allow you to unmute during the Q&A part. And there's also going to be a breakout room section where everybody will be unmuted, and there's going to be some chance for other folks to share stories of what's going on in their communities. So today we're going to be talking about how value chain coordination practitioners are adapting value chains in their communities in response to COVID-19. And before we dive into that, I just wanted to take a brief moment to talk about value chain coordination. It's a term that we at Wallace Center use a lot, but we just kind of wanted to share the way that we frame it and what we mean when we use it. Historically, we at Wallace and lots of others in this sector focused a lot on hard infrastructure, on food hubs and processing and cold storage, thinking that that was really going to be the thing that allowed local food systems to scale up. And if we only got enough of those in the right places, we'd be good to go. These things are obviously critically important, but they aren't enough on their own. We've really learned over time that there's a lot of other critical activities that go on in food systems development that really make these systems function well. And I think we've all seen from COVID and the impacts of this pandemic how critical relationships and networks and connectivity and communications are when a crisis hits. Value chain professionals perform roles that make these things possible. They do things like market matchmaking, like technical assistance provision, innovating new ideas, convening stakeholders. This work is done both by people in businesses, people in the value chain that are buying and selling, and also support organizations like nonprofits, like government agencies. Value chain coordination is the set of activities that supports the development of a food system so that when the time comes to build that food hub, that processor, that extra freezer space, it's efficient and responsive to what's actually needed and what's actually missing in the community. It also ensures that when there's a shock to the system, like right now, there's a strong set of relationships and communication channels that make it easier to adapt. So we're going to hear about some of those adaptations that are going on in real time in response to COVID-19 from some folks doing value chain coordination work in their communities. And first up, we're going to hear from Molly Riordan from the City of Philadelphia's Department of Public Health, and she's going to talk about some changes to supply chains in Philly. I think, Molly, you can unmute yourself, right?
I can. Thank you. Thanks, Ellie, and thanks to the whole Wallace team for inviting us to this conversation. I'm excited to learn from all of you. I am the Good Food Purchasing Coordinator for the City of Philadelphia, which typically means that I'm trying to increase access to healthy, sustainable, fairly produced, and regionally sourced food in our city programs. But right now, actually, I am not the person who's doing a lot of food purchasing. And the value chain coordination has been happening in different ways at the city. So there's three main ways that we're working on COVID response right now. The first is as a direct service provider, which is a new space for the City of Philadelphia to be in. We have opened 40 food access sites and are working with two of the leading food access organizations in Philadelphia, Philabundance, with whom many of you are probably familiar, and Share Food Program. And, you know, thinking of value chain coordination, one of the things we're always trying to do is make use of existing infrastructure. So not only are we valuing the expertise of those organizations, but we're even using an old warehouse, used to be a beer distributor and is now packing out 32,000 boxes a week to deliver to anybody who walks up at any of the 40 sites. Those 40 sites are a combination of recreation centers, existing food access organizations, community development organizations, places where people already go. So again, thinking about how we can leverage our existing infrastructure in the city to provide those services. So that's the first way that we're working on that right now. It helps to know what to look for in a food warehouse, by the way. I was the one who was like, yeah, you need loading docks and hand washing stations. Just those technical things that we all know, but some people might not. The second way is just as a connector and facilitator. So we have weekly calls with food access partners. There's usually between 80 and 100 people on the call, which you could imagine could get a little unwieldy, but it's been a great opportunity for one-to-one connections so people can update one another on what's going on, identify gaps in the things that they need. Often it's food and supplies, and try to make those connections. And also to identify gaps in service and how folks can connect in order to serve the greatest number of people possible in Philadelphia. I didn't mention this, but Philadelphia does have a 25% poverty rate. And we know that approximately 1 in 3 people in Philadelphia right now is food insecure. So all of our organizations working together has been a great way of doing that. Our Food Policy Advisory Council is also working on that one-to-one connectivity. We have what we started calling a food system exchange, which I set up and monitor, that allows people to post what their needs are, and then they can connect directly with one another to meet needs. And it's been an effective way of connecting people with distributors or other food providers that they may not have worked with before in order to both provide pantry boxes and prepared meals to people who need them. And the third way that I think a city government is most effective at being a value chain coordinator is identifying folks in the nonprofit and the for-profit communities who might need one another, making those connections and then stepping out of the way. That's been, I think, maybe the biggest joy for me in doing this work, if we can find joy in this work in this time, is identifying opportunities where we already see a growing regional food demand and opportunity on the supply chain, and connecting that with this effort has been meaningful. So in Pennsylvania, Southeast Pennsylvania, we have something called the PA Grain Coalition. It's a coalition of growers, millers, processors, bakers, folks who are interested in grain in the Pennsylvania region. And they've started doing a Neighbor Loaves program, which we've connected with one of our very large and quickly successful food redistribution programs that is now doing pantry box distribution and meal distribution. So that group has gone from saving food waste to feeding a lot of people at home, and making those types of connections has been a great way of promoting the local food work in Philadelphia. So that's my 5 minutes. I'm going to stop there.
Good job. I realized I was on time and then you were on time. Good job. So up next we have Hallie Casey from the Sustainable Food Center in Austin, and she's going to talk about some innovations that have been going on down in Austin. Hallie, I don't see you on my main screen, but I saw your name.
Yeah,
I'm muted. Oh, there you are. Hi. All right.
Hi. Awesome. Thank you. Hi, I hope everyone's doing well. My name's Hallie Casey. I'm the Supply Chain Program Manager at the Sustainable Food Center, which is a nonprofit here in Austin, Texas. And I'm going to talk about a project that we've been calling the Neighborhood Pop-Up Grocery Project. So the Sustainable Food Center is leading this project with the help of a great organization called Food Shed Investors here in Austin that work at the intersection of finance and good food and local food, and it's being funded through the city of Austin. This is a relief project, like specifically for crisis relief. So we started the effort of this project around the end of March. So a lot has been changing. The model basically is converting closed restaurant dining rooms in areas of Austin with high barriers to food access into converted like pop-up grocery markets. This would also include surplus local food being bought from farmers and ranchers, particularly from producers that were selling to restaurants and lost clients, or to school systems and lost clients. And then dry goods and other things that we could source locally would be purchased just through restaurant suppliers, so we wouldn't have to bring in any retail suppliers. This is being funded through the City of Austin. So basically, the City of Austin is donating this food back to restaurateurs to be sold at low cost. So it's providing economic support to culturally important restaurants, and also providing low cost food options in areas with high barriers to food access. Oh, I forgot to start my timer. Hopefully I won't go over.
You're doing great.
We started off this work with the impetus of the City of Austin. They basically put a call out when the pandemic really started, and we started to see a lot of economic impact and a lot of issues around food access, to say, you know, we have just approved this crisis money. If anyone has a concept that they think could be effective, you know, hit us, let us know. So we went to them, and as did Food Shed Investors, as people who've partnered with the city and kind of worked through this concept together in partnership with a couple of different offices at the city. We based our location selection methods, like site selection, around a City of Austin food access map that's been a really great asset to us. I think about a year ago, the Austin Department of Public Health, as well as the Office of Sustainability, worked together to create a ArcGIS map that's interactive and like really clearly outlines where the areas of most need are here in Austin. The other two big assets that we used to be able to lift this project off the ground was SFC is part like farmer focused organization, but we also do have a food access wing of the nonprofit. And so we were able to engage stakeholders and other organizations that were doing food access work to try and identify those restaurants that would be good partners, from both from a kind of neighborhood cultural standpoint, and, you know, where are places that people trust, where are places that people will be plugged in and be able to learn that there is this new offering there, as well as where is, you know, the best location, what's walkable, what's accessible. And then SFC also has a network of local farmers. Just being in this space and having done work here, we were able to connect back to farmers. And we also are working with the Common Market Texas, who has been doing some amazing work with the Texas Center for Local Food out in Elgin, providing pre-packaged produce boxes. And because they were already kind of in our neighborhood, Elgin's not too far out of Austin, they're able to help us supply restaurants that might have less cold storage or a smaller staging area where they might not be able to do a full grocery offering. So we are also offering two different models to restaurants, whether it's something that's a little bit larger, that's basically a grocery setup, or something that's more of a prepackaged box option. Oh, sorry, I have a question. Are the restaurants where you are providing the grocery stores still in business? Yes, primarily. Well, actually, no, all of the restaurants we've been talking to are open for takeout. This would be an option for supplementary income. This is really important because the grocery model or the prepackaged box model is relying on staff time. And so it's a bit more of an ask to ask restaurants to open back up versus folks who are still trying to have some income through takeout. So some of our challenges that we've had so far with this project, one is just the timeline and how quickly the needs of the communities have been shifting as the pandemic goes on week to week. Local government is amazing, and the City of Austin has been doing incredible, but having 3 organizations, including the city, makes it hard for us to pivot in some ways. So us being able to be reflexive and flexible around where the actual needs are and what is happening in the communities is something that we're still figuring out. And then the other thing that we have run into challenges with is restaurant connections. And that's where we're seeing as SFC how going forward past this pandemic, how we can grow to include the whole supply chain and not just, you know, farmers to institutions, and how we can facilitate those larger conversations, particularly just with convening stakeholders and, you know, knowing each other's names as people who are all doing work in the food space here in Austin and trying to make it a better place going forward. Yeah, that's pretty much what I've got. Are there any other questions about what it is that we're doing?
We're going to have one more presentation and then we're going to have a break for questions. For
Okay.
you. But that was a really good question from Tracy, so I'm glad you answered it. I thought the same thing. Okay, thank you, Hallie. That's an amazing idea. And I think that hopefully lots of other places have had similar ideas or can try and replicate it. Our last presenter is A-dae Briones from the First Nations Development Institute, and she's going to share what's going on in Indian country. Take it away, A-dae.
Great, thank you. First, I'm going to begin by saying I apologize if I offend anybody in my presentation. You know, we're talking about supply chains, and in Indian country, it's pretty dire right now. And so I just start by saying that I don't mean to offend anybody with anything I say. I meant this presentation as a way to start conversations about our supply chain. And I'm talking about the American supply chain. And second, I begin with the understanding that the goal of a supply chain, the food supply chain, is to make sure people get enough to eat. And the other goal is supply chains provide the goods that people need. So like medical supplies, and we're seeing breakdowns all across the country in all of these sectors, in the whole process. And so the supply chain to me is like taking the raw goods to production, to distribution, to consumers. And like Ellie said in the beginning, a lot of the discussions about supply chain before the pandemic was about cold storage, was about value-added production, was about transportation systems and making those more localized. And while Ellie did say that, you know, that's not enough, what we're seeing in this pandemic is, I don't know how else to call them, epic failures in our food supply chain system. One, we've always known that there are food deserts or that people are not getting enough to eat, and that should have been an indicator to us in before the pandemic that our food supply chains were hurting. But now we're seeing those hunger and food not getting to people in ways that we've never seen before. So it's only highlighting the fact that we've had weakened food supply chains. And when we think about all those things that go into the food supply chain, Indian country is at the very end of that supply chain. And so when I'm talking about our food and our work in Indian country, we're feeling the effects of almost every little disruption in those food chains, all the way from price to transportation, to production, to distribution. So what we're seeing in the Southwest in particular is the lack of food, right? There's an entire region of the country that is not getting enough food. And so I work for First Nations Development Institute, and I run the Native Agriculture and Food Systems Initiative. And originally we are like a grantor, so we would support projects and people within the system that were working on different parts of the supply chain. And much like my colleague from Philadelphia, we're finding ourselves pivoted into the direct service role. And a lot of folks in the supply chain are finding themselves in that position, not because we want to be, but because, again, it speaks to the failure of our supply chain in that financial systems are not moving fast enough to support the changes needed in the supply chain. So for instance, we can give a grant to a nonprofit who's maybe working on transportation systems, but there's so much infrastructure that needs to happen before that gets up and moving that we're finding new players in our food value supply chain that are becoming direct service providers. And so again, that causes more disruption and more chaos. And when we think about our supply chains, we not only have to think of them in short term, like how do we get people fed now, and how do we get people water so they can wash their hands, which are both critical issues in the Southwest around Navajo Nation and the Pueblo communities, but also long term, like how do we create new value supply chains that are responsive to some of our most vulnerable communities. And in our country, during this pandemic, we are witnessing, I guess, the bare bones of our supply chains, right? We see the most vulnerable populations in our country being exposed. We see nursing homes with elders that are actually having some of the highest rates. We see Indian country, which are the communities at the end of the value supply chains, and we see inner city communities that are having higher rates of COVID than others. And so those are all signals to us who are working in the supply chain that something is amiss. And how do we create value supply chains going after this pandemic or during this pandemic that are more supportive of value supply chains that speak to our values, that speak to who we, like the whole food system. And we see this shift, right? We see the pandemic is affecting a global shift. I'm almost done. We see a global supply chain being hurt, right? So then we see a shift to localized food systems. And really that's where we're, a lot of the funding should go. But again, like finding ourselves in the position of direct service providers is really hard. But in general, I think Indian country is working hard at trying to make those ends meet. And what we're finding is the partnerships between organizations like Wallace, like philanthropy, are actually meeting the need. But now we're having to think about recovery and how do we institutionalize those relationships into a supply chain that is normalized and that we have less of these weaknesses as we move forward. Okay, sorry. Over, yes.
That was great. We're still in time.
Okay.
Thank you. So we're gonna take about 10-ish minutes for questions, and then we're gonna go into some breakout rooms to hear from other folks about the way that they're adapting and adaptations they're seeing in their community. And thank you so much to our brilliant presenters for sharing their stories and the ways that they're approaching this now. And thank you, A-dae, for particularly bringing up what we carry forward after things get back to normal, because I think there's a lot that we're learning that is really sort of showing us the ways that we can try and be when this is all over. So thank you for bringing that up. If you have a question, you can put it in the chat box, or you can go to the bottom, and when you hit participants, there's a little option that pops up that says raise hand, and then we can unmute you if you'd like to ask your question verbally and not in the chat box. So one question that I had from listening to you, Hallie, is about how this is going, how the grocery store pop-ups are going. Are people coming to them? It's kind of a little bit of a mental shift to rearrange where you go shopping for food. Are people responding well?
Yeah, so this project was first conceived of, I think the first email I got about it was on the 27th of March. And I think that one of the challenges we initially faced was with pacing and timing, and really being able to figure out where the city was and what the city was looking for us in terms of a timeline. So we started off with a really clear proposal and timeline, and we got restaurants involved. And then we had about 2 weeks where we were kind of in a holding pattern, just waiting for final approval of the funds from the city. And I think that that caused us to lose some momentum. So we are up and running. We don't have as many restaurants on board. Currently, we have 2 restaurants with a 3rd one hopefully opening soon. This project is one that I think is kind of coming from top down. We're not like hearing back from restaurants that like this is the support that we need. So we're trying to approach them and be flexible and treat this very much as a partnership, and we're here to support you however you need. But I think that one, you know, SFC doesn't have relationships with these restaurants. 2, these restaurateurs are in crisis mode, as everyone is, and so asking them to do another thing, even if it is, you know, even if it can be an economic support, can also be like a really challenging ask, especially if you don't have that relationship set up. We are seeing in the restaurants that we have open, there has been interest from consumers. But yeah, I think that just kind of getting that momentum and setting that relationship up has been challenging. In terms of farmers, we have had a couple of farmers get interested in this. Again, I think that the timeline and the momentum was kind of a staller for that, but we do have people that are on board. I think we currently have 3 farmers that are either that are excited about the project.
Is it Hallie?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Yeah.
So question about different types of food producers. How did those relationships get created? Have you created new relationships? Where are you all buying food from? And I think that's to all 3 of you. A-dae, I know you all have created some new relationships with meat supply chains.
Since you called me out, I will just respond to that very quickly. So what we're finding is the food supply chain as it exists, which means that there are probably supplies in food storage that have to be transported to some of the communities we work with, which means you're gonna have to load it on a semi and you're gonna have to drive it a couple hours to whatever rural community we're working with, is a major headache. It is costly, it's hard to find drivers, it's hard to find trucks, and much less cold storage in the communities that we work with. And so in response to that, we've connected with the Grassroots Meat Alliance. I know I'm totally not doing them justice, but in the Southwest, who is a group of grass-fed ranchers who do small-scale processing and normally have their own transportation systems and are more easily able to take those supply trucks and take it to wherever they need to be, because when they're smaller, it does mean smaller meat loads, but we're able to schedule them out like 2 or 3 months. And so we found that was much easier than having to work with large scale distributors. So we're making more localized connections between the rancher and the community. And the key there, of course, is the meat processor. Like, I can't advocate enough for meat processing entities in all parts of the country. We actually need these in all parts of the country. And if there's ever anything that comes across your desk that you can do to support small meat processing, I would encourage you to do that, because that is like one of the key barriers, or not barriers, depending on where you're coming from.
Thank you.
I would just add, sorry,
yeah,
I'll just add quickly on that note, what I was describing, what the city of Philadelphia is doing, so much of it is relying on the gluts that have been created in the food supply chain in order to take advantage of lowest cost opportunities to feed the most people. And that is not necessarily serving our farmers well at all. I've seen some other value chain coordinators in our area doing a fantastic job to pivot their purchasing to almost 100% local. And those are the types of folks who are doing direct delivery to households, and their delivery businesses have grown by 6 times in the past 6 weeks, which is fantastic to see. But that is for households that can afford to pay. And there's a significant divide in the type of food and who is getting supported by what types of entities based on ability to pay. And that's one place where I think policy and talking about how we institutionalize this, I saw that was another question. There needs to be policy around what types of purchasing we're prioritizing, even in times of crisis, because if the city of Philadelphia and others like us were supporting our regional farms, it would help us all recover a lot more quickly.
And I will say, for us and for this project, we are able to purchase local food because it is being subsidized. So there was a question about like how it's setting up. The city of Austin is basically allowing SFC to conduct the purchase, but the city of Austin is actually like doing the money itself, and it will be donated to the restaurants. And because of that, because the restaurants aren't having to buy into this, they can sell it for lower than what actual cost is. So we can, you know, keep it at a low cost option. So in that way, we're able to support local farmers. But yeah, again, I totally echo what Molly said.
Cool. I'm going to do one more question and then we're going to do some breakout rooms. So I think this is a question that's been on my mind a lot, and A-dae sort of touched on it earlier, and you all have mentioned it. What steps are you taking, or what would you like to do to try and create lasting partnerships beyond the crisis? Are there relationships that you've developed that you think are going to be really key later? And, you know, how are you looking into the future?
So I'll answer that really quickly and then others can chime in. I think one, finding partners who understand that our supply chain is broken, and that's not only, so I'm finding a lot of our partners that are stepping up are partners who have at some point not only like questioned the supply chain and why there's food deserts, or why the food costs are so different depending on what zip code you're on. Like, those partners have really stepped up, and not because there's some pragmatic role that they have to play, but because they see this as an opportunity to actually change our supply chains, to not only meet the needs of Indian country, but when you meet the needs of our most vulnerable populations, you put less pressure on the rest of the supply chain. So it like does us all good to see that whole spectrum, as opposed to on one side we're saying like localized is the answer, but on the other side we do have to have this grand vision of the entire value chain within our country, so that one end is not pressuring the entire system. And so finding those, I guess, philosophical points, this is where we talk about culture and philosophy and values. Finding those partners that you can at least have those discussions with is like a good start to a relationship. And then you get into the pragmatism, and then you get into the cost, and then you get into, and one of the ways we're institutionalizing our partnerships, like for instance with the Wallace Center, right? We've been around each other for so long, but like now we're actually like working together to make sure these food deliveries happen, and that in itself is the start. And of course we have responsibilities after this pandemic, is to continue those relationships and then, you know, work on institutionalizing those. But it's like back to the basics, like it's human relationships, it's talking to one another, it's having conversations with one another. And that is as much part of the value supply chain as cold storage.
I think that was really well said. For me, I've had a lot of conversations here in Austin about like what it actually means to take this experience and translate it into the message of like, we've all been talking about this for, you know, however many years, and how do we make that clear to people who might not have been bought in philosophically before this, but now can really see the weaknesses in the system. And like, how can we go and talk to, you know, commercial grocery outlets, or how can we talk to, you know, restaurant buyers who were not at all interested in a farm to table before this? And how can we talk about what it really means to have resiliency and redundancy in your own supply chain, and what that can mean economically, and what that can mean for your customers and for your business model. Kind of here at SFC, at least, we've been talking to a lot of incredible partners that have been philosophically aligned for a while. We've been blessed here in Austin with a lot of people who get it. But after this, I think that it's going to be so much easier to talk about, you know, what it really means to people who didn't get it beforehand. So I think that's going to be a big focus for me, is like talking about what the message is, and how do we communicate that takeaway to actually lead to real change.
Okay, I'm going to hand it off to Susan, and she's going to talk about our small groups.
Yeah. Hey y'all, Susan here from Wallace Center. First off, I just want to give a deep bow and appreciation of A-dae, Molly, and Hallie for sharing your stories and for working so tirelessly in your communities to crack this nut and to solve these challenges. And I know there's a lot of other people on the call who are doing the same kind of work. And so we want to create an opportunity for you all to share. I already see it starting to happen in the chat box right now of people saying like what they've got going on, being able to share some of these strategies and tactics of both what you're seeing and doing in your communities and also what you see as kind of some of the missing pieces, gaps and resources that are needed so that we as a collective, as a community can start gathering those together, giving messages to funders, to the USDA, and to one another about the direction that we need to head as we're heading out of this pandemic. So that's what we're really going to do in these next probably like 12 minutes or so in a breakout. So Andrew, if you could send us out into the groups, and just so you know, each one of the breakout groups is going to have somebody facilitating, probably not an opportunity for everybody to chime in, but please, you know, what we're trying to do is really crowdsource what's going on in the field so that we can all make better sense out of this and be able to tap into one another's brilliance as we move forward out of this pandemic. So Andrew, if you want to go ahead and press send, and we got everybody back in here. Would love to hear just a little bit of a harvest from a couple of the groups. So Wallace staff, you guys want to chime in and just give a little bit of insights of what came up in your conversations? Maybe we could just start with the first question about some of the strategies and tactics that people are using and seeing to connect surplus and needs.
I'll jump in there. We had a couple of points. First was the value of existing relationships, that kind of ecosystem of supply chain actors and other organizations that can be relied upon to respond in this way. People are seeing that that's extremely rich and valuable now and in the future. The use of the 211 communication lines to connect people who need, who have, and even 311 we've heard. And other folks are reaching new groups by bringing kind of untraditional voices to the table, non-English speaking and refugee organizations, in order to understand their needs and then therefore respond at a community level.
Great, thanks, John.
I can share. Some of the things that were coming up repeatedly in our group was how CSAs and farmers are being creative, working together and finding ways to get things to market, but also people mentioned that production is not in full swing right now. So for a lot of folks, this really isn't necessarily where all of their effort is able to go. Another thing that repeatedly came up was the stress on small scale producing, both for grains and for meat, and being just really things being wasted. There was one person in our group who mentioned 13,000 pigs that had been killed because they have nowhere to take them. Someone else mentioned someone bringing a big load of potatoes to an urban center and just saying, here, please take them for free. So a lot of creativity and like restaurants and processors working together to get animals processed, but at the same time, just showing a complete dearth of mid and small size processing ability.
Okay, thank you, Natalie.
I can share from our group if we have time.
Yep.
So in our group, one of the threads was sort of thinking about how these innovations might be potentially longer lasting into the future. And so how do you both plan for the right now and the immediate, but also laying the groundwork for potentially consumer awareness and buyer habit changing over time. And to that end, some of our folks mentioned that this pandemic is really an issue around health and climate, both human health as well as ecological health, and to what extent do we need to be supporting and raising up the importance of agroecological production and raising consumer awareness around agroecologically produced, soundly produced food.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Sarah. Other groups?
I'll jump in. This is Lucy. So we talked about for the first one that restaurants are really stepping in and selling food, and that, you know, the big supply chains are having a difficult time, but we're really being put in a position where we can put both restaurants to use to sell directly to consumers, and also the food workers that were laid off or are not that are not able to work right now can be repurposed. And so there's a lot of possibility there and flexibility, but there is a concern about worker safety and making sure that that process and that that shift is safe for both the consumers as well as the workers.
Really critical point. Thank you, Lucy. Annalena?
Yeah, I'll share a few from our group. We're seeing a lot of, folks shared a lot of shifting funding strategies. And the Vermont Agency of Food and Ag, they're creating new funding specifically for COVID responses to do simple polling to understand where food is coming from and what retailers are available, as well as creating a COVID economic response recovery team to help manage this. And then there was a really interesting private sector partnership that emerged up in Maine with the food bank shifting their model to get food where it's needed most, and having LL Bean help provide the packaging support to manage that distribution.
Great, thank you. Lots of similar themes came up in my group's conversation, and some of those kind of unlikely partnerships emerged, and specifically with the transit authority and rideshare companies that are getting involved with distribution, as well as the United Way really stepping up in ways that maybe are a little bit unpredictable for them, and helping with distribution as well. So it's great to see some of these partners that we haven't worked with as much in the past really coming to the table. So thank you everybody for contributing your ideas and what's going on in your communities in those conversations. We will be sharing out these notes with everyone, so expect those within the next 48 hours from the Wallace Center team. I just want to quickly hand it over to Sarah. I think as Sarah's going to talk a little bit about kind of the ongoing conversation at the Wallace Center around value chain coordination, and how we really want to kind of nourish this skill set because we know it's so essential in helping to create more resilient and equitable food systems for the long term, which I think that's one of the real dynamics for us right now, is both holding space for the urgent while also thinking about systems change and thinking about the long term, and that our actions right now really will have outcomes that matter for the long term. And I think that these relationships that we've been centering here in our conversation today are really critical ingredients for that. And I think value chain coordination is the way to do that. So Sarah, if you want to kind of tee that up, and then we'll close out the call.
Sounds great. Thanks so much, Susan. Well, I just wanted to thank the Wallace team for putting together this kind of rapid response and emergent conversation on value chain coordination. In the spirit of continuing this discussion, I am pleased to announce a new discussion group on the Food Systems Leadership Network, which, if you're not already familiar with, this is an online platform that Wallace launched over a year ago. And this is the link here. We can drop some links into the chat box momentarily. For those of you that are already familiar with it, you know this homepage. You can hop into this platform and see these various different discussion groups to join. The brand new one here is Value Chain Coordination. It launched this week. So we invite you, if you are either a transactional partner, a support agency performing any of the roles of matchmaking, convening, all of those things. We've got the kind of more full description in the chat itself, or in the discussion group itself. This is a place to keep the conversation going. At NGFN 2020 in New Orleans a few months ago, we had a whole track on value chain coordination, seeded a lot of great discussion, and there was some efforts to continue the conversation. So this is our way of doing that. We hope you will join us. And when you do, you will be able to join this group. You can post questions, you can post resources, and we hope that this could be the start of continuing the conversation around innovations and adaptation. I will also drop this link here in the chat box because I realized that you cannot click my picture screen. So thank you all, and I'll hand it back over to the Wallace team.
Quickly want to ask Ellie, are we going to drop a poll in here?
Yeah, I think Andrew, can you tee that up?
Yeah, I can start the poll.
So as Sarah said, we are, continuing, and Susan are continuing to focus on developing skill sets around value chain coordination, and we're hoping to learn a little bit more about what's going on in folks' day-to-day work, what kinds of value chain coordination roles you're playing, and where you sit in the supply chain so that we can continue to tailor our technical assistance and our resources to meet the needs in our community. So if you see this poll and if these things apply to you, respond, and we will keep working to help you develop these skills.
Thanks everybody for filling out that poll, and just want to again appreciate the speakers and all of you for spending time today to have this discussion with us, and just want to encourage you to continue to share your stories, your questions, your ideas in the FSLN COVID-19 listserv. The response groups, a really active listserv that we have going on right now. Lots of great resources that are coming up, and it's really the source of where we're finding kind of the energy for these calls, and where we're finding the threads for the things that we want to bring into group discussions. So encourage you to share your voice there and keep an eye out for next steps for other calls from the Wallace Center. And I see David's question there, the link to the listserv. Maybe if one of my team members could get that here, and we can also include it in the notes when we send that out within the next day or so. So keep an eye out for a follow-up message from us, which will include the link to the recording, the notes, and the joining for the listserv. So thanks again, everybody, for joining this afternoon. Take care of yourselves, stay healthy, and we'll see you in the next round.
Thank you all. Thanks, presenters.
Wallace team, are we going to stay here for our debrief? Should we go into let's go into a Teams call?
Either way.